Good evening. I'm Ricardo Bryan, and welcome to another in the series of our courageous conversations. So glad to have you on board. And today promises to be one that will be exciting, interesting, and something that I know that you're going to want to be a part of. So here's what I'm telling you from upfront. Go ahead, share this link, invite a friend to watch, invite a family member to come in and watch, and let us be a part of this conversation today. Today, we finally reached the point that I've always wanted to be, and that is the point of having a discussion with law enforcement. It was actually 1 month ago today, that I was convinced to lean into this conversation about racial injustice, particularly perpetuated against men of color, Black men to be exact, in this society, and for many times at the hand of law enforcement. Instead of backing away and saying that my life is fine, it was critical, important that we press into this matter, even for the sake of our young children growing up, to provide for them a better world, a better society. We have been following 4 very important protocols in our courageous conversation. One, as posited by Glenn Singleton in his book, Courageous Conversation about Race in School. 1, stay engaged. 2, experience discomfort. Yes, it will get uncomfortable at times, but don't worry. It's about speaking our truth. It's about expecting and accepting that we will not find solution at the end of this tonight, perhaps, but it will lead to action. Action where you and I will become better and will be able to navigate this area and this issue called racism in our society. Tonight I have some brothers to help me, but before I do that, before I bring them into the discussion about law enforcement, watch this video. We come back right after this.
Just gotta get some things off my chest. Tough times, I hope y'all holding up. We gonna be alright, cause we always is. But I'm feeling like this.
How many mothers have to cry? How many brothers gotta die? How many more times? How many more times? How many more marches? How many more signs? How many more lives? How many more times? Take a look around. Can you see it now? Don't be colorblind, cause when they're killing mine, they'll try to justify it. Oh, each and every time. Playing in the park, taking you a jog, sitting on the couch, in your own house. Never seem to matter what we do. You think we don't matter, but we do. You got a problem cause the city on fire. But you quiet when niggas die. Let the soul about that body that we buried. You were God, now you no longer have to worry. It's so hard to sing these words out loud. All these beautiful, precious black lives, lost in the name of senseless white pride. Tears falling from our eyes. How many mothers have to cry? How many brothers gotta die? How many more times? How many more times? How many more marches? How many more signs? How many more lives? How many more times? Tell me, how can you be quiet? You know the language of the unheard is a riot. All we ever see from you is violence. You know you ain't no better if you silent. You talking about the city on fire. Where your rage when my people die. We ain't slaves, let my people fly. Now it's time, watch my people rise. How many mothers have to cry?
If you've ever seen my
How
son's
many
eyes,
brothers gotta die?
just know they
How
shot his
many
eyes out.
more times? How many more times? How many more marches? How many more signs? How many more lives? How many more times? How many mothers have to cry? How many brothers gotta die? Tell me, how many more times? Oh Lord, how many more times? How many more marches all across the world? How many more signs? Oh, how many more lives? Shame I gotta act. How many more times? I'll leave you with that.
How many more? How many more lives? How many more times? Well, we had one more name that was added to the list, the parade of young black men that was murdered at the hands of law enforcement. Elijah McClain, walking home from the store with an iced tea in his hand, ski mask for blood disorder that he was suffering from, and he now is deceased. And we found this out that happened over almost a year ago in Denver, Colorado. Ladies and gentlemen, it is my pleasure to bring on board today some brothers who were in law enforcement or are in law enforcement to help us tackle this whole matter of policing the community or community policing. To first help me join is another Brian. His name is Nigel Bryan. He joined the NYPD 1992. First command was the 42nd Precinct located in East 161st Street in the Bronx, South Bronx, and went on to Highway 1, then Emergency Services Unit. He's a brother who's been in law enforcement for 20 years in the Bronx. Help me welcome Nigel Bryan. Hi, Nigel.
How you doing? Nice to be here. Thank you for inviting me.
Of course, bro. Thanks for coming along. Next, I introduce you to a man whom this was a long time coming. Remember, I told you that I was jogging and my run was interrupted by a conversation with law enforcement. Well, that law enforcement officer I met was Officer Maria Herrera, and she put me on to call this gentleman eventually who this conversation started. However, his name is Reggie Wright. He was born and raised in Trenton, New Jersey. He attended parochial school from first grade through to 12th grade. Reggie attended college in Jersey City, New Jersey, where he earned his bachelor's degree in computer science. Upon graduating, he played basketball with a travel show basketball team for a few months and also played for a couple teams. He went on to play professional basketball in Europe. Upon returning, he decided to pursue a career in law enforcement. Reggie currently works for a police department in the administrative division in New Jersey, and his primary focus is on teaching character development curriculum in elementary among elementary students, and he also leads a high school program. It's my pleasure to introduce to the courageous conversation today a brother in law enforcement, Reggie Wright. Hi, Reggie.
How you doing? Thank you for having me. I appreciate it. Thank you so much.
Of course, Reggie. Thanks for being here, brother. And next we have is a man who retired as a chief of police and executive director for safety and security at Howard University. Prior to his service at Howard, he served 27 years with the District of Columbia Metropolitan Police Department in Washington, D.C. For 10 years of his service, he served as an assistant chief of police for the MPD. Help me welcome my brother, Brian K. Jordan, retired chief of police. Hey, Brian, how you doing?
Thank you, Ricardo. Thanks for having me, and I'm glad to be here with such a fine panel.
Thank you, man. Thanks. Well, as somebody said to me earlier when I posted this, there's a lot of Brians on this panel today. We have Nigel Bryan, we have Ricardo Bryan, we have Brian Jordan, and Reggie Wright, who may be called Brian by the end of all of this. Gentlemen, get comfortable, relax, because we're going to go in today. And many people are interested in hearing from law enforcement. When I posted that I'll be having a conversation with law enforcement, folks were saying, yes, let's hear it. We want to hear it. I find no better panel to bring together than who I have here. One, in terms of Nigel, who worked in the Bronx, South Bronx. He interacted with the Caribbean people, with Hispanics. He interacted with what he went where the NYPD goes. Then we have Reggie Wright. Reggie, basketballer. Reggie, who is in New Jersey, different area, different division, different experience. And then we have Brian Jordan, retired chief of police. Gentlemen, I'm going to jump in because we want to learn about you before we go straight in. Let me just ask you, starting with Nigel, what attracted you to law enforcement?
Oh, it started early for me, from my teens, actually. I started in security in the hospital. I actually was going to college to become a lawyer, but as we know, the police department is one of the most visual aspects of law enforcement, and there was always that law enforcement seed inside of me. And it's really a basic concept. I just want to be out there helping people. I wanted to be the person that when they call 911, I'm the one responding.
Okay.
And, hopefully bring a solution, help that person, help that the homeowner that's being broken into, help the person that's on the street that's been assaulted. Again, when they call 911, I wanted to be the one to respond and help citizens of New York. So it's like it goes to the motto of protect and serve. It's a motto that I've taken on personally. So that always attracted me to the police department. And one time I tried to I actually shied away from it, but like I said, it's one of the most visual aspects of law enforcement.
Okay, thanks. Let me go to Reggie. Reggie Wright, what attracted you to law enforcement, sir?
Oh man, great question. Great question. I was playing basketball overseas and came home one year in the off season, and there was a friend of mine that I knew. We went to school together. We went to lunch together, and he had became a New Jersey State Trooper. And while we were at lunch together, he asked me a very simple question. He said, "What do you plan to do once you get done playing basketball?" I said, "I really didn't know. I hadn't given it much thought." But one of the things that I knew was that I admired him as a peer. Someone that was the same age as me, someone that looked like me. He was the first African American male that I had came in contact with that was an actual law enforcement officer.
Yes.
The job didn't seem to have changed him. He was still personable. He was a man of integrity. He was still relatable. He was relevant. And for a lack of terms, he was still cool. He still had his swag, so to speak.
Yes.
I felt like if this brother who I knew from school could go out here and make an impact in the community in New Jersey, then it was something that I felt like I should do as well. So he encouraged me and spurred me on to take an interest in law enforcement, and I pursued it. And once I pursued it, the rest is history, as they say.
All right, sir. Thanks, Reggie. Chief, what attracted you to law enforcement, sir?
Well, it's funny because I think my journey was a combination of Nigel and Reggie's. That I was growing up in the projects of Chicago, and one of my good friends, his father was a Chicago police detective. And thinking like a 15-year-old boy, I go to what Nigel was saying was the image that he was a Chicago police detective. He wore a suit and tie. He was so cool that we all called him Slick. He had a Mercedes Benz. He had a cabin cruiser boat. He had a high-rise apartment in Chicago, and he carried a gun legally. So that image was like, I could do that. And so that's from the time I was 15, I knew I wanted to go into policing. So that began my journey to find out more and see what I can do and all those different things. So it pretty much mirrors Nigel and Reggie's journey.
Okay, good. So we found it, ladies and gentlemen watching now. We got, first of all, the reason. And by the way, those of you coming on board, please share this. We want the world to engage in this conversation with our Black men right on the screen who are in law enforcement, have been and are in law enforcement. So you have all told me a journey in going into law enforcement. What was your experience with law enforcement growing up as a young man, a young boy in your neighborhood? And I'll share mine before I jump into you. For me, growing up in in St. Catherine, Jamaica, I can't recall having a negative experience with law enforcement, or as we say back home, the police. I've never had one. In fact, what's very interesting is we actually, in some cases, we make fun of the police right now. And so, in fact, we'd actually, in my neighborhood, mimic the police by even walking around with toy guns in our waist, because we saw them as this symbol of power, but it was a power where we like being around them. So for me, in all the years I lived in Jamaica, with 26 years before I moved to these United States, or 27 years, I never had a negative interaction with the police. And I just wanted to set that up in terms of my personal experience. I'll share other experience along the way. But what was your experience with law enforcement growing up as a young Black boy, a young man in your neighborhood? Nigel, you want to share anything with me?
Mine was similar to yours. When my parents came here from Jamaica, we settled in the Bronx, and we lived in the Bronx. And I remember images of the police as a kid, because back, during the 70s, we would play outside. We're the generation that played ball outside, basketball,
Okay.
baseball. So they would come around, we'd move out the way, they'd take a look, and they kept moving. And where I lived in Northeast Bronx, I don't know if you're familiar, lived in the Northeast Bronx. We were on the border of also Mount Vernon. Now, for whatever reason, from time to time, Mount Vernon police would also come to the neighborhood. But we knew when they come, because they weren't patrolling. They'd speed on through and kept on moving. So, as kids, you get fascinated with the lights, the cars, all that's cool, it looks nice, and stuff like that. Fast forward a little bit in the teens. My experience, I really didn't have a negative experience myself,
Okay.
other than, make sure you get to school, a truant officer catch you. And back then, it was truant officer catch you, they threw you in the van. It wasn't like come into the van. They threw you in the van, dropped you at school.
Okay.
And another one was, I grew up in the Northeast Bronx. There's a huge park. And unfortunately, some things were going on there where, you would have uniformed police, or especially the plainclothes police. And my interaction, not my personal interaction, but what I've seen became different. You had some police that would come through, and they would look at somebody, they would literally, out warning, grab you off the court, put you against the car, and start asking you questions. And I started seeing this more and more. So, fascination became a little bit of a question of why and what. And, being that I didn't have a negative experience with the police at that time, it was like, well, they must have done something wrong for the police to do something like that. But it was
So growing up, you had a positive interaction as far as
interaction.
Okay.
Yeah.
Let me swing over to the man who grew up in Chicago. Chief, what was your experience growing up with law enforcement on the streets of Chicago as a little boy, finding your way in life?
Well, the unique thing for me is that the police department, for my friends in Chicago, they know the 21st precinct was in the backyard of our building. And when I say the backyard, is that we shared a parking lot with the police precinct. So from the time of a very young child, the police was just ever present in our backyard. So some of the negative experiences, I think that the first time that I was pulled over by the police, I hate to even tell the story, but I was 10 years old. I was out after, me and my brother was out after curfew, and we play in the community across the street while it was being built. And so we're trying to get home, and because the precinct was in our backyard, we would run from one community to another. And so when I was about 10 years old, we was running home, and the police pulled out their gun and said, "Stop." Well, I stopped. My brother had to stop.
Yes.
So they took us in for curfew, but it was the first time that a police pulled his gun. And
What type
another
of impact
experience.
did that have on you, Brian, at 10?
And see, again, at the time, it was just normal. I didn't think, they put a gun on me, anything like that. But also around that same time, one of my good friends' brother was shot and killed by the police, and he was coming out of a drugstore, and the story was that he had stole some gum from the store, and the police stopped him and shot and killed him right there on the corner outside the drugstore. And so, again, no grief counselors. That this is my classmate, and her brother was killed, and you just had to move on from that. And then, when I was about 13 or 14 years old, I'm out with my sister, and she was 5 years older than me, so she was legally allowed to be out. In Chicago, the law was if you're out with an adult, you're not violating curfew. But the police stopped me, said, "Hey, you're out violating curfew. We're gonna take you in." My sister, who's 19, like, "No, that you can't take him in. He's with me." They insisted, and 4 or 5 police officers end up locking her up and throwing her in a wagon and charging her with a crime and taking me in for curfew. So this is a situation where growing up with police and the whole aura of police brutality. And I just got to tell one more quick story, because it's something that people don't think about. I had a cousin, and he grew up in a different project. He grew up in Robert Taylor, and the police would try to get you to, as they say, snitch. And back then, everybody had a real nice afro. That they took my cousin, they took him in, and to try to get him to talk, they start cutting off his afro, and he had nothing to say. So they end up cutting off half of his afro and sending him home. And that was to send a message to the community and everybody that, hey, this is what happens. So it was that was probably the most dramatic experience, because back in the 70s, your afro was your identity. And that was their way of abusing us to just show the power over African Americans.
And how old were you at the time, Brian?
I was probably 14 then. I was in high school, and he was probably 17.
All right, we're going to delve into this. And once again, ladies and gentlemen, you're watching me speak with 3 members of law enforcement, past and present. And this one you heard, Brian Jordan, he made it to chief of police. So we have a lot of tracing to do to get there. Let me go over to Reggie, the one who grew up in New Jersey, Trenton, New Jersey. Reggie, tell us, what was your experience? At what age you first had a negative encounter? What was your experience with law enforcement growing up in Trenton, New Jersey?
Yeah, just to be quite honest with you, growing up in Trenton, New Jersey for 17 years, and then going on to Jersey City for an additional 5 years.
Okay.
So you figure for 22 years of my life, the first 22 years was inner city urban environment. Grew up in the heart of Trenton. For anybody that may be listening, Wilbur section of Trenton, East Trenton. It's a very rough area. Raised primarily by my grandmother, an old beautiful lady from Corinth, Mississippi. Also spent some time with my mother in the projects in the Twin Towers in South Trenton, New Jersey. So 2 demographics that's filled with a criminal element. But to answer your question, I really didn't have much interaction with the police. I observed the police come into the city, walk into like the bodega, or ride my bicycle around town, or going to the local park to play basketball. And this was on the tail end, I guess, of the war on drugs. So I would watch them jump out of the paddy wagon, search people at the corner store, the local dudes around the way that sold drugs, or better known as hustling. And I quickly realized I didn't want to be on that side of the law. But at an early age, I fell in love with a sport called basketball. And basketball really helped me. I spent the majority of my time at the basketball court. The police didn't come to the basketball court, because there typically wasn't problems at the basketball court where I would go. So I really didn't have any negative interaction with police throughout high school or college. And I didn't have any siblings. I was the only child. So I didn't really observe anything. What I did know is that if you were hustling, if you sold drugs or were using drugs, that typically was where you had a negative interaction with them based on my observation growing up. So I spent a majority of my time at the park trying to hone my skills on the basketball.
Thanks for that input, Reggie. And I'm going to tell you right now what was my first negative interaction with the police. And that is, as I've been going through this, actually learning and pressing my way into the African American experience here, I've started to reflect. And I started to reflect that about 2004, 2005, living in my old neighborhood, Piscataway, New Jersey. Nice neighborhood. I went running one morning, as I often do, and I'm jogging one late morning. This is about 10 a.m., not like particularly 6 a.m., 10 a.m. A police cruiser pulled up next to me on the street that I jog every morning, on the street that I live every day. I've lived for the past 5 years at the time, and said to me these words: "We're not bothering you. We just got a call that someone kicked down a door, and the description fits you." That's what I was told. My question was, I live here. I've always lived here. I had to give my name, my address, and then a few minutes later, they drove off. About a month or a year later, I can't recall, I'm returning from the post office. I decided to walk. I like just walking and running. Walk to the post office. On my way back, again, this was about maybe 12 noon, 1 o'clock. Another police car pulled up beside me and said, same thing. We just got a call. You fit the description. And the question is, how many of us just naturally fit the description? So, gentlemen, I'm going to move from your childhood days. You've now signed up. You've taken your oath. You are part of law enforcement. Chief, with that background you had, that history of growing up, that 14, 15-year-old experience you had, 10-year-old experience you had, talk to me about this notion of fitting the description, where somehow we always seem to fit the description. Where does that come from? And have you experienced this in your policing, in your career of policing? In this notion of fitting the description is one that I find frankly annoying.
Well, it's not a simple answer. That
Sure, man.
First of all, police officers operate based on, for the most part, a radio call. They get a radio call, and a dispatcher will tell them that. And so again, trying to explain it the best way possible.
Sure.
First, it goes to a call taker.
Okay.
Call taker is expected to get as much information as possible. That person will say, yeah, person kicked in my door. They'll say, okay, describe him. He was a black male. He was 5'10", 165 pounds, wearing a gray plaid jacket and a blue tie with gray stripes. Now, that if you got that description, you would see me and say, hey, that fits the description. Unfortunately, what happens is there are people who will say to stop Nigel and say you fit the description. Now, again, in law enforcement, one of the things we do know that oftentimes a person who perpetrated a crime may discard clothing so as not to get caught. So when I say it's hard, that I gotta say that most officers, even though and like the description the situation you described, they did their job, but they did it in a humane way. They did it in a way where they simply had to follow what they were getting, but they didn't throw you to the ground. They didn't say curse you out. They didn't put you in a situation where we're gonna handcuff you for my safety when you haven't done anything. Those are the type of things that take legitimate police conduct to a level of inhumane treatment. And those are the things that African Americans go through on a regular basis that creates a lot of the experience with police where they just don't trust the police.
And let's jump there because we need to get there. We're not going to tiptoe around this because we just enumerated the names, what's going on. Elijah McClain, Freddie Gray, Eric Garner, George Floyd. We enumerated the names where it seemed to us that typically it is unarmed, handcuffed even black men that somehow the pressure, it just always goes through the tough way. So question I have for you, officers, and just forgive me that thing, just work with me today on it, right? And Reggie, let me throw this around at you, and and Nigel, NYPD. The question I have in mind is, in your interaction with your colleagues, have you observed where you've seen a blatant display of just racism, just based on the fact that of the color of the skin? Did you observe that in your policing over these years, where your colleagues, you went hard at this guy because he's a black man?
Yeah. Did you want to go first, Nigel, or me? He's muted.
I'm sorry, Richard. Just real quick, because as the chief was explaining that, and with the lead-in that you put in, Ricardo, it's really sad and unfortunate, and not saying it lightly, that a description, you got the script of a male, and the first person we might pull over is that male black. And I've seen that happen so often in the South Bronx.
Yes.
For the good officers who are out there, it put them in such a gray area, for lack of a better word, of a gray area. Because, like the chief explained, you get that radio call, you get a description which is vague at most, vague at best. And the first person you pull it over happens to be that black male or female that just is walking down the block. This is walking from wherever to going from A to B. And they have every right to do so. And I think what's also been lost, and I say this at risk, what's also been lost is that art of interaction, that art of that first interaction. I mean, we've seen cases where we just seen on TV. I think of the young 21-year-old who was suspected of taking something, and the immediate interaction with the police and that male. I mean, I know when I was working in the South Bronx, you had to have what they call a reasonable doubt, or certain levels to stop a person.
Okay.
Vague description of a person, and you see a person that happens to be walking down the street, and that's the first person you jump on. There has to be that art of conversation, and that's definitely lost.
I guess I call that probable cause.
Exactly. And it seems like the art of that has been lost. And again, I'm not trying to make light of this type of profession. It's not easy. There are times you can walk up to a person and say, by the way, this and ABC. And there are other times where it doesn't go that way. It goes south very quick.
Okay.
Yeah.
Reggie?
Yeah, let me chime in real quick.
Yes.
I think what they both said is excellent. If I could just add something to it, my personal experience in the town that I work in, without mentioning the name, just to give a little context, less than 3% of the population is African American as far as residents, but there are quite a few African Americans that come through on a daily basis, whether it's for work or shopping, whatever the case may be. So to answer your question, when we have calls come in, like the chief said, like Nigel said, sometimes it's very vague. It's extremely vague. The call comes in, someone, came out of a home. It's just a black male, 6 feet, no further description. That's how it may come off from communications, from dispatch. Mm-hmm. What I have witnessed, whether it's myself or other officers, white officers, they will come back on the air and say, headquarters, do you have an additional description? Do you have anything else outside of the fact that this male is 6 feet and he's a black male? They will say that over the air. If headquarters responds and says, the caller didn't state, they didn't give any further description, I've heard numerous officers, at least that I work with. Now, I've been on the job for 15 years in 2 different departments, both suburban departments, though. I've heard officers say on multiple times, give the caller a call back, a return phone call, and ask them if they can give you a further description of the suspect. Ask them if they can tell you what kind of clothes, if he has any facial hair, any markings or tattoos. They will ask that over the air. Now, with that being said, if dispatch comes back and says, well, I called back, I'm not getting an answer, or they don't have a further description, then we have to go with what limited information we have. But just understand that the information is primarily coming from dispatch, and it is our job and responsibility to make sure dispatch is getting as much information as possible from the caller.
One of the reasons I wanted to press in here tonight, Brian, Reggie, and Nigel, is because I wanted to get the police perspective too, right? But I also want to get the police's perspective from your unique position as African-American men. And I'm wondering right now, and I'm going to go there, but at all times, at the backdrop of this conversation, where I'm going is how do we empower our young men in their dealings with, and can we, their dealings with law enforcement. But I've got something out of this conversation, first from what the chief responded, and then everything that Reggie and Nigel said, that there's also a level of, or there's also added to that a factor that relates to the calls that come in to the police about the suspect. And so I'm even wondering if the police gets a call, a vague call, or even a false call, how do you treat that? If the call is shown to be something clearly false, or even like what happened recently in Central Park when this lady literally called the police and said, an African-American man right here is basically harassing me. It was on video. She was the one doing something wrong. And I think my recollection is that she has still not been arrested for putting in a false report. How do you do with something like that, Chief? Have you ever had to deal with a false report? And how is it dealt with? Because I'm going to go deep into other things now. But this description fitting, somehow it bothers me that I fit it all the time. Go ahead.
Well, and see, let me say this. And so we have to deal with the elephant in the room. That one of the major issues, and the montage you showed today was an excellent encapsulation of America in terms of why there's such distrust for police. Yes. So when you see name after name after name, situation after situation after situation, that you have to understand there is a systemic racism element in law enforcement around the country. So in dealing with that, we have to acknowledge that whether it's Nigel's description or Reggie's description or my description, we can describe how it's supposed to go. Okay. But what happens is that when you still have people who don't see the people that they're policing as worthy of the type of language, behavior, conduct, because there is a difference in you talk about the Central Park situation. There is a difference where you go and you respond, because let me give some aspect of what we're talking about. First of all, that when we talk about policing is not monolithic. Policing is different, it's local. So there's 18,000 different police departments. There's somewhere between 800 and 1 million law enforcement officers. So that when you start talking about what happens in Decatur, Georgia versus the Bronx, New York versus Camden, New Jersey, you're going to get 3 different aspects of what's happening. What's constant in America is that of all 18,000 police departments, there is some form of systemic racism inside those departments. So that when you talk about that, that leads to the way Black people are often treated, and there has to be ability to weed it out, find out who they are, address them, because you'll hear police officers around the country, good police officers don't like bad police officers. So from an executive standpoint, we have to find ways of acknowledging that police needs to be reformed and come up with some ways to hold bad officers accountable and to find it before it occurs so people are not treated in a bad way.
And I'm going to press into that some more. Let me swing over to Nigel. Because Nigel, you were with the NYPD for 20 years. Come off mute, right?
You know what? I have to piggyback on what the chief just said. And it's very relevant. If you're going to be patrolling any area in the United States, you have to see the people you protect. You have to see them. And that expectation is well-deserved in low-income areas as well as high-income areas. People in low-income areas, the last thing they need is for a police officer that come in with his or her biases in regards to people of color, whether it's a lack of education, whatever it may be that occurs in our lower income neighborhoods. They just need the police to be there to help them when they need help. And I agree with the chief that unfortunately, you know what, racism is systemic. It's systemic throughout a lot of law
Society.
enforcement, a lot of departments. You have, listen, NYPD is a prime example. You have a New York City Police Department. You have officers that come from up north, down south, that have never really interacted with people of New York City at this level. I gotta tell you, what surprised me is how many officers suffer from cultural shock. They've never seen people living the way they've lived. They've
Yeah.
never seen it, and they don't know how to react to it. So they figure if people are living in a certain way, they must be treated in a certain way, and they deserve that type of treatment. No,
Mm.
you gotta understand. You not only symbolize.
Give me a second there, Judge. I just got to just circle that a little bit. So you're saying in your experience with NYPD, policing in the area for 20 years, that there's a perception that people's economic situation, socioeconomic situation, basically warrants a certain type of treatment that they would not give further up the road in Westchester County, somewhere up in those areas.
Absolutely.
And you've observed that as a law enforcement officer.
Correct. Yes.
So there's a question to ask on that, Nigel. And gentlemen, opening this up to you. I'm having a debate going on online. And by the way, those of you who have questions, put them in tonight. I'm throwing this down for your questions. I know you're here to be heard. I know you're here because this is important for us. This entire conversation has started out because a police officer, an ex-police officer now, knelt in the neck of an unarmed, handcuffed black man. And so it's all stemming out of this. Gentlemen, has any of you ever observed one of your white officers doing something to a black person or anybody for that matter, and you have had to deal with it? And I'm going to ask from A, Chief, B, Reggie, policing in New Jersey, law enforcement in New Jersey, Nigel, NYPD, because there's a question coming after this. Have you observed that? There's a comment saying here that it's not generally black police officers are decent, it's the white police officers. Somebody else disagree with that. Let me ask you, gentlemen, what have you observed in your career policing? Chief, officer, administrative, give us some feedback.
Yeah.
Now, how did you deal with it, Reggie?
Yeah. So let me just chime in for a second. Is that what the chief said and what Nigel said? It was excellent. I just want to piggyback too, as we're going into this, what you just asked, Ricardo, based on what Nigel just said. One of the things that I've observed here in New Jersey, being a very diverse state, a densely populated state, is that we're very segregated. Segregated based on our class system, segregated based on our race, our different preferences, whatever the case may be. But one of the things that's interesting is I was on an interview the other night and I spoke about it, is when you look at a lot of the urban inner city areas in New Jersey,
yes,
you think about the population, oftentimes, let's just say Trenton, New Jersey is over 80% Black and Latino. But when you look at the police department, after they did their layoffs, I believe there's somewhere around 250 or somewhere around that vicinity. 80% of them are white police officers. So you have police officers, as Nigel said, policing a community that's culture shock. They're not sure how to engage, how to interact, how to deal with minorities in this element, in this environment, because they've never spent time. They didn't go to school, they weren't raised, they don't necessarily live there. I know for our civil service test, once you get hired and you live in the city for a couple of years, you then can move out. So that adds a different element to policing when you feel uncomfortable with those in the community. And that's our job, right? Our job is to serve, protect the community, and to have a heart to want to help those within the community. But as the chief mentioned, there's between 800,000 and 1 million police officers. Not everyone gets into the profession with the heart to serve, with the heart to give back to a community the way the people on this panel has. So that makes it very difficult. Because we have to be honest. The same way you have teachers that get into teaching just to have summers off, to have holidays off. You have police officers that get on the job because of the schedule, because of the pay, depending on where you are, and different contractual benefits. That doesn't make it right. right?
Yes.
We're here to protect and serve, uphold the law, and we should truly care about those that we're protecting and serving. But if you're in a dynamic or demographic rather that you're completely unaware of how to address them, that's going to change the game.
And that seems to me to lead to the big question. Chief, I'm going to bring you now on training. Chief, is police training the problem, or are American police just inherently racist? This is a question that came in, and I'd love you to tackle.
So
Is police...
So again, and, no, go ahead.
Yes. Is police training the problem, the lack of proper training, or are American police just inherently racist? This is a question that came in that I'd love you to tackle, Chief.
Right, and so let me try to tackle it, because see, here's what happens is that this is a very layered issue that we're talking about, and sometimes we try to address a whole profession in 240 characters or a Facebook post.
Yeah.
That people will say, oh, it's training. People will say, oh, defund the police. People say, oh, let's just dismantle and start over. Let me say this, is that there are some best practices where there are some police departments that have created some reform changes that has led to some accountability. And if you bear with me, let me just give you an example, and I'll talk about my backyard.
Go ahead.
In Washington, D.C., in 1999, the Washington Post did a Pulitzer Prize story that ran for about 5 days. In that story, it looked at police use of force and around the country. And in that article, it labeled Washington, D.C. as the #1 department with regard to use of force. That as a result of that, at the time, the Metropolitan Police Department entered into a memorandum of agreement with the Justice Department. Oftentimes, it comes out in the sense of a decree. But what happened was that the Metropolitan Police Department said, okay, help us reform. Well, as a result of that working along, and I happen to work in the Office of Professional Responsibility, so I was intimately involved in working with the Department of Justice, where we came up with 148 recommendations that had to occur to change the Metropolitan Police Department. Yeah. That you hear today, people say 8 can't wait. Those are things that were done as a result of that memorandum of agreement that becomes best practices. But we also did some other things. For example, when you talk about the conversation of defunding police, that police shouldn't just respond to everything. Well, if you look at our earlier conversation, one of the first places you have to start is with police communications. So what we did was, before you had fire department personnel handling communications for fire, you had police personnel handling for police. So you had officers with guns being dispatchers. What the District of Columbia government did was created an Office of Unified Communication. It took professional call takers, it increased training, it created situations where you can divert certain calls that shouldn't go to police to other entities, and it became a way of making sure police aren't responding to everything. Also, what we did was we went from as far as looking at force, not only what ended up in force, but what leads to it. We were one of the first departments that made officers report every time they pointed their gun. That we created a force review team where we didn't take the same officers who patrol the streets with you, create a separate team to investigate all uses of forces, and work with the U.S. Attorney's Office, who created a separate team to investigate police use of force. So until when you take those things, you go back to, once you hire somebody, the training that comes in with it. And you train them on de-escalation. You train them on verbal judo. You train them on crisis intervention. So when you look at the result was systemic change in the Metropolitan Police Department, which led to the then chief of police, who was Charles Ramsey, becoming the chair of the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing, that further analyzed policing from a nationwide standpoint and created a 116-page document that looks at how police departments can reform themselves around the country. So I don't want to just say, oh, look at training. You
There's
look
more
at
to it.
what
There's more
people,
to what you're saying.
it's a very complex situation. And if you want to go back and you can pull up on the internet all those 148 recommendations, that you can come up with change, but you got to understand that all 18,000 police departments haven't done that. And so if you're not doing it and you're not creating a situation to do it, and even from there, we went further where now there's body cameras that can capture what's going on. There are situations where you look at Minneapolis. One of the biggest things that you never saw before was officers fired within 48 hours for misconduct. So
in fact, I like the
there's
idea
some
of
reforms we can do.
I like the idea of the body camera. Reggie, you're being me to say something.
Yeah, I am. So a little bit different angle from the chief. Just looking at some of the comments that are coming in, I really think should be addressed. So one of them earlier was that, so the culture shock caused police officers to treat people inhumane. Absolutely not. Like, I don't think culture shock is ever a justification for treating someone unfairly. That's not our job. We swear an oath to uphold the law. So absolutely not. I don't think that. But as you go on further, Ricardo, if you look at some of the comments, I do think personally that the police department should reflect the community in which it's policing. Now, an issue with that I personally feel is when you look at the urban / inner city communities where we have a lot of Latino and Black representation.
Yes.
We talked about this offline. If I go to Hampton University and I get a degree in whatever the case may be, and I graduate, and even maybe I further my degree and go get my master's, but even if I stop at my bachelor's degree, do I want to graduate with a bachelor's degree and then go work in Norfolk for $40,000 a year? For the most part, African-American men that go into higher education oftentimes want to get into the private sector. So it's not just law enforcement. When you look at the educational system that we have in America, 2% of our teachers are Black male teachers. There's a reason for that. It's not because Black men are not qualified or capable of teaching. It's because when you look at how we're compensated in the educational system, it's not very appealing. It's not sexy. It's not something we inspire to do or become. I feel like law enforcement and the Black community as a whole as well, we need to be in the schools. Like, I teach this character development curriculum and I love it. It may cost me a promotion because if I get promoted, then I won't be able to do what I do. But I look at it as a grassroots effort. I look at it as I'm in the schools and I'm before Black boys and girls, they get a chance to see someone that's a police officer, see how I treat them, see how I speak to them, listen to what I'm talking to them about, managing your emotions, about having good decisions making skills, having short-term and long-term goals. If they see us in positions of authority, they may inspire to become police officers. I feel like in order to change the narrative, there is a distrust between the police and the community. And I have a police and teens program that I do in the high school to try to bridge that gap. But I feel like just like we did with baseball, you had the Negro League, you had the major leagues. You had people like Jackie Robinson that went into the major league and became a trailblazer. The same way in basketball, it was dominated by white basketball players. And slowly over time, as we got into the NBA, you now see the landscape of the game has changed. I feel like that our sons, our daughters need to be inspired by seeing some African-American Latino police officers that do the job well, do it with honor, do it with integrity, and truly care about the people they're policing, and that one day they will grow up to want to be police officers themselves. We have to look at the heart of people and love people in our community. And I don't think one more thing, Ricardo. I don't think that we can expect. And listen, I have a white police officer who's the chief in Arizona that has been nothing but a tremendous brother to me. He's a believer and he's a solid dude. But at large, I don't think that we can expect white police officers to know how to treat or handle us, even though they take the jobs. Because there's no class in college or an academy that's going to teach a white police officer how to deal with Black and Latino people in the
And
community.
therein lies my question. But therein lies my question, Reggie. Right there lies my question. If there's no class that doesn't teach a white police officer to engage a significant part of the population, in fact, many of them will be going to police those, then for me, there's a problem, Chief. And here's what's bothering me in the conversation that I'm trying to get at. What makes Dylan Roof, the white teenager, I believe he was at the time, to go inside of a church, a prayer meeting, murdered the people in the prayer meeting? He was escorted out, put a vest put on him to take to jail, while Freddie Gray made eye contact and ran. Probable cause. He died a few weeks later. I don't have to tell you all the stories. You know them, gentlemen. But for me, is what goes through my mind. What makes this white boy who just murdered somebody, he was protected, and that's fine for me. But what causes him to have been given a different treatment than somebody, of my view, who perpetrated the exact same crime, usually kill on the spot? And so the question I'm pressing on, Reggie, when you just said that, I'm saying to myself, if we can't expect them, the white officers, to police our community with heart, my point is we should expect them to police with heart, because they made a oath to protect and serve all communities without favor. I forgot the rest of the oath that was there. But yeah, that is it for me. Where I go back to training shouldn't it be something where I should look no different to a white officer?
Yeah, I wasn't saying heart though, yes. Ricardo. I wasn't saying heart. I was more so saying a cultural awareness.
Yeah.
Right. There's the same way for me. If I went to Wyoming or North Dakota, South Dakota, there may be a fear that I may have just because I'm not aware of my surroundings. I'm not used to that element. I'm not used to being in that environment. And I'm not saying it's right. I'm not saying that gives anyone the right to then treat someone unjustly. I'm just saying that I feel like if we're in certain geographical areas and a certain demographic, then we should try to recruit and try to hire people that's familiar with being in that environment and dealing with that element. It's no different than education. There's no class in college to teach white female teachers how to educate our black boys and girls.
Yes. Noted. Nigel, you have anything to jump in on this before?
Yeah, because I think there's a couple of factors. You see, there's no easy answer, even though we do have to get to the answer. We do have to get to the answer. But you got a couple of factors, and I think Reggie pointed them out very well. You got to understand, especially particularly for black men, educated black men, if you get your master's, you get your college education, being a police officer at 40,000, you're more qualified for over 40,000. 40,000 not really looking attractive, becoming a police officer. So that's something that, all of us, and a lot of states have to contend with. I mean, they'll have now, I understand now, police departments, they require that you have 16 credits before you get into a police department. But again, like Reggie pointed out, you got a well-educated man. He's not looking at 40,000. He or she is not looking at 40,000. They're looking at a higher pay scale, deservedly so. Also, we're talking about particularly young white males that become police officers. You have to understand, a lot of these applicants that come from the suburbs, affluent suburbs, the police department is their first real job. They have no other, real job career experience. So you're having a young man or woman from another community, the suburbs, that's never really interacted in a city type environment. Now you're asking them to interact in a city type environment in the role of a police officer. And that role is serious, as we're seeing throughout the country. What you do as a police officer is scrutinized and watched every day. Every day. So again, just think about that. You think the probably most job experience, respectfully, might be a Burger King. That may be in a working as a assistant in some type of factory or something like that. Now they took the test, they passed. They're a police officer. You're asking that person from the suburbs to be a police officer in the city and has no idea of the interactions what going on and what goes down in the street. Now, when you don't take the time to learn, because I've seen it personally, when you don't take the time to learn your community and how your community functions and the word on the street, it's going to be a bad interaction. It's going to be a bad interaction.
And that's where I just, maybe chief, maybe I need to do an audit course, just audit police training, the academy, both they can, all the three of you can tell me. But somehow, here's what I, as the only non-law enforcement person in this conversation, I've always thought, if I'm in an interaction with the police would be the first person to try to de-escalate it. What I find from observation, it is, and typically men of my hue, is always the one who quickly backing away and trying to say, yes, sir, no, sir. I've watched police pull up on a car and a white person's in the car and screaming at them. And there's a conversation going on. As they approach a black person in the car, suddenly we are trying to say, may I go into the glove compartment? May I? And the idea that I need to ensure that I don't tick you off, who should be the trained person in this interaction. Mm-hmm. And so, Chief, I'm wondering what I'm missing, because I thought that somehow in the academy, there should be some level of training on de-escalation. Here's what happens, so that it doesn't become an expectation. To me, it should be a question of, this is what you do as you interact with someone who is running from you because they're scared of you. Why does it always go to, I need to kill him or I need to shoot him?
So because there's a lot of conversation going on, and I'm even watching some of the comments and stuff, because I want to try
the comments. Let me run the comments.
No, let me jump some, because sure. one caller said changing the narrative. So I want to try to tackle some of these things, because again, the narrative is supposed to be, the montage you showed was African Americans being killed at the hands of policing. So the narrative is, how do we address systemic racism in policing?
Yes.
So that's the narrative I want to stick on. And then, so there's been conversations about community policing and black people policing black communities and stuff like that. First of all, Nigel talked about Dylan Roof. That Dylan Roof is a perfect example of, we train all those things. It's about how you affect that training. We train implicit bias. We train verbal judo. That police can take you in without killing you. It's the thing is that we have to look at policing, because that there's two standards that guide policing and use of force, deadly force. That's Tennessee versus Garner and Graham versus Connor. Those are two laws that pretty much dictate how police can use police of force. Now, the key element of those two things is that officers should use a standard of reasonableness. That there is a difference in whether it was reasonable and whether it was necessary. So somebody else commented about, they lose their job, but they don't go to jail. Community policing is a dual term, community and policing, that if a police officer is fired and they go to trial and black people don't sit on the jury and they don't convict them, then the community also failed in their job. So as policing, we gotta get our job better. And so again, when we talk about community policing and the concept of, can black people, or should black people just police their community and white people police it? No, that's what we fought for. Okay. We fought to be able to police white communities, and white people should be able to police black communities. But we should hold them accountable for policing black communities the way they police white communities. So again, on my final point, let me just make this last point, because this is my recommendation that I think needs to happen in police departments around the country. So we've created body cameras.
Yes.
We need to create an audit and integrity function where every body camera is monitored and audited from the time they come on to the time they go off, with the exception is if an officer says this is a personal conversation and turns their body camera off, then that can occur, because what you can do is you can go back and check that what time they went off, what time they went on, and if any police action took course during that time, then you hold them accountable for it.
Okay.
But when we talk about holding officers accountable, if we can hear what they're saying to citizens, if we can see how they're treating citizens, and we take immediate action to address it, discipline, get rid of them, we can make some changes along with the other 148 changes, the 8 can wait, and all those things, because the narrative has to be addressing systemic racism in policing.
I'm going to address that. Thanks so much for that very cogent input there, Chief. Reggie, I have something for you. I'm going to throw all of this to you, but first of all, thank you so much for tuning in, family, on this Sunday evening. Remember, this is for you. It's a courageous conversation, all under the theme, raising young Black men. And in tackling that, we're dealing today with law enforcement, because we are sick and tired of being sick and tired of how Black and brown people seem to have to basically be submissive in the face of power that should be protecting us. As I speak about young men, Reggie, I'm going to start with you on this one. Here is something that was posted on Twitter a few weeks ago. It's by an 18-year-old young man called Cameron Welch, right, Reg? And of course, Chief and Nigel, I want your input. It said, when he was 11 years old, his mom, and a lot of mothers watching tonight, a lot of moms, single moms even, who struggle with this. How do I prepare my sons to go there and not become an endangered species? Here's what he said, gentlemen. By 11, he learned to memorize the list of warnings his mom had given to him through the years whenever he's walking out the door. Is a list that I've not yet told my boys, but I want your feedback. Here's the list. Do not put your hands in your pockets. Do not put your hoodie on. Don't be outside without a shirt. Check in with your people even if you're down the street. Do not be late, too late. Do not touch anything you're not buying. Never leave the store without a receipt or a bag, even if it's just a pack of gum. Never make it look like there's an altercation between you and someone else. Never leave the house without your ID. Don't drive with a wife beater on. Don't drive with a do-rag on. Don't go out in public with a wife beater or a do-rag. Don't ride with your music too loud. Don't stare at a Caucasian woman. If a cop stops you randomly and starts questioning you, don't talk back. Just compromise. If you ever get pulled over, put your hands on the dashboard and ask if you can get your license and registration. Gentlemen, Reggie, I come to you. As I talk about do-rag, I have a nephew, Jaden Heath, right? He likes to wear his do-rag to keep the waves, the ocean going on in his head. This is a young man in college. This is a guy with an amazing heart. This is the most gentle soul you can find. It boggles my mind that putting a do-rag on is it becomes a menacing threat to somebody out there. Reg, these are what an 11-year-old had to memorize for his very survival. Does this list work when it comes to interacting with the police?
Yeah, well, listen, growing up in the city, I wore a do-rag back then, and I still wear a do-rag to this day. I identified my style, the way that I dress, steez, swag, whatever you want to call it, based on the environment and the element that I was indigenous to. So oftentimes, if you saw me walking the streets, I didn't look any different than maybe the dude on the corner that was actually hustling.
Yeah.
And I knew that I could be identified as a criminal, even though I wasn't. That wasn't my lifestyle. That wasn't my heart. But I knew that I represented something that for the law enforcement within the community, that's what they often dealt with. We have to deal with people on an individual basis. If they're not doing anything wrong and you don't have a reason to stop and talk to them or apprehend them or question them, it shouldn't matter what they're wearing. I've had that same conversation to some extent, what you just read, to my 9-year-old son.
Talk to me about that, Reggie. I have a 9-year-old, as you know. Talk to me.
He's getting tall. He's lean. But by the time he's 12 or 13, he may look a little bit older. He may be 12 or 13. It looks like he's 15 or 16. I've told him, you get stopped by the police, comply. Listen to what they're telling you. Don't have your hands in your pocket. If you have ID in your pocket, make sure you notify them and advise them that I have identification in my pocket. I'm going to go in my pocket and get my identification. Keep your hands where they can see them. If it's something that they're doing wrong, whether it's racial profiling or something that's illegal, we will deal with it later. I just want to make sure you come home first. As the chief said, as Nigel said, as you say, as I say, systemic racism runs rampant throughout our society. It's woven into the fabric of our culture. It's not just in police. It's in all sectors of life, unfortunately. We have to deal with it. And that's what we're trying to do. We're trying to have conversations, figure out solutions and how we can address it. It's not right. We need to hold each other accountable. If I see someone at work that's doing something wrong, the way they're treating an African-American boy or girl, I'm going to absolutely step up and say something without a doubt, because that's my job. That's my duty. I'm a black man first before I'm a police officer. And I know what it's like because I grew up in the hood. I'm from the hood, right? And the hood has helped shape me, raise me to the man that I am today. I don't despise it. I don't think anything different of the cat that has a do-rag on or has piercings like I do, or that has a hood on his head. There's nothing wrong with that. We need to treat people the way they should be treated. If you've done something wrong, you should be dealt with without excessive force. We can treat black people, white people, Latin, Asian, it doesn't make a difference, with dignity and respect. So that list is unfortunate. But we're here today on this panel discussion to try to make a difference and to try to change the narrative. That's why we're here. And these brothers that came before me were trailblazers. And I'm trying to follow in their footsteps and do what they have done for a man like me.
Yeah, thanks for that, Reggie. Nigel, I want to go to you before I go to Brian, because Brian, I'm going to want to find out from you. Have you had to deal with this in your department as a chief where somebody used excessive force? I want to know you deal with that as a chief. Brian, that list.
Ricardo, before you get to that, I just want to piggyback what Reggie's saying. And, I think he was spot on what he's saying. And also, it speaks to the stereotypes that society, in regards to this, has placed on young black men. I've heard that conversation. My mother has told me that. My mother's told me the same thing. Make sure this, make sure you don't have your hands in your pocket, make sure you're respectful. My mother has told, and she drilled it into my head. And and I heard some of the comments, and I hear what Philip in his comment, his contribution. And it's unfortunate. And another part of that we cannot escape, and I know a lot of people on the panel know this. It's not only young black men that wear the do-rags too. It's a lot of young white men that emulate the black culture that wear the do-rags as well. So I think that speaks to what Richie's saying. We have to treat each other with the respect that we want to be treated onto us. And I've known as a police officer, I can tell you really quickly, there used to be a young man that the community used to call the police on him all the time that fit that description. You had the do-rag on. You had the paintball jacket or whatever, And it got to a point where we got into a conversation, to the point where I drive by, he can say hi to me, I can say hi to him. So again, I think it speaks to stereotypes when we start looking at young men with do-rag, they're wearing a certain type of clothing. We don't know who they are, where they're going. They could be going to school. They could be coming from college. And that's one of the things that I know. Listen, I grew up in the Bronx. I know a lot of young men that fit that description, but they're hard-working men. Hard to, boost their education, take care of the families. So it comes down to what Reggie is saying. It comes to we have to respect each other, regardless of what we look like. It's like that saying about the book. You look at the cover, but you got to turn the page. You look at the cover, but you got to turn the page and look inside the book. So, It's not an easy answer, but
Yeah,
it's
it's
out
not an
there.
easy answer, Nigel. We're struggling with it, and so Brian, we're struggling with this because, as Nigel said earlier, it's not just young black men, teenagers who wear do-rag. My son, 12 years old, wears a hoodie because all the basketballers in his school, in his middle school, they have a hoodie crew. Why does my son should be more menacing than his Asian or white counterparts who are in the same hoodie? You see, and that's why for me as a Caribbean man, I struggle because as I said to you, I come to this conversation, gentlemen, seeking to hear, to learn, to press, to question answers, to ultimately try to see where can we reach in moving this narrative to a level of action that really change what has been going on. Chief, talk to me about your department. Talk to me about leadership in the face of what is clearly brutality that's really beaten out mostly against people of color, black men. How do you, as a chief, grapple and deal with that?
Well, let me say this. I think that America has a kitchen table, and there's 6 legs to America's kitchen table. It's health and safety, security, economics, politics, leadership, and race and racism. So when you say, how do we deal with that, is that leadership has to say that if you are in charge, you are accountable for the culture of your organization. So with that said, that there was a recent article that said that organizations with black chiefs of police are less likely to have use of force. And again, like I said earlier, it doesn't mean you have to be black to lead an agency in a cultural way that's humane. But if you're white, you have to understand it's your role in leadership to make sure that your department's not discriminating. One of the luxuries that I call it a luxury because I got a chance to go. I graduated from Howard University as an undergrad, and I got a chance to go back and be the chief of police for the university's police department, Department of Public Safety. Now, think about this.
Yeah.
That Howard University is 98% black in its undergraduate population.
Yeah.
So now, from a leader, I'm making sure that as a police department, our goal is not to lock you up. Our goal is to make sure you spend those 4 or 5 years on Howard's campus safe. Safe from the community, safe from sexual assault, safe from the environment which you operate in. That our goal, again, goes to what is about preserving peace in the community. So you can create that leadership. And what happens is, if you're engaged in a community, there are young people who are saying, Chief, this is what we want you to do. And if you listen, you can police the community in a way where they are comfortable. Now, here's one of the things that's also part of America's kitchen table is that 17% of the population is going to love you no matter what you do. 17% are going to hate you no matter what you do. You got a chance to work and shape that 66% that works with you. So when you're in an environment and your goal is to work with the people you're dealing with, you can change culture. It's a heavy lift, but that's why they pay you the big bucks. And if you want the chair, commit to doing the job.
This is about changing culture. This is about creating change. Those of you joining in, we're about an hour and 24 minutes into our courageous conversation with law enforcement. We know there's a lot to tackle. We know this is layered. We know this is not easy. In fact, there's a question that's popped in here from attorney. I believe the question for Chief Jordan was, how have you addressed excessive force in your department? So back with you, Chief. Have you had to deal with that? And I want to press into that because, again, what I'm seeing on television, last night I saw something on YouTube or wherever that really broke my heart. It is a black man that was somewhere, it happens every day, everywhere. But a white officer stopped him. He said, "It's not me. It's wrong. It's mistaken identity." And somebody was saying, "No, it's another person." Another white officer came behind him, grabbed him, threw him on the ground, actually broke his wrist. After four of them together on him, eventually the person who called said, "No, I tell you, it's not him. It's another man," and pointed where the other guy is. And simply brushing off the man with a broken wrist, just been brutalized, they apologized and sent him along his way. Everybody watching tonight, have that as a backdrop. And I think they're saying, Brian, Reggie, Nigel, are we touching what's going on? And I'm getting the feedback from you, which I love, and we're hitting it. Training, attitudes, and so back to you, Chief, on it. Have you had to do with any of that, and really how you dealt with it?
So remember, I talked about that Pulitzer Prize story, which led the department to recognize you had to change.
Yes.
That Chief Ramsey came to, at the time, I was assistant chief in charge of criminal investigations division. Chief Ramsey came to me and said, in order for us to be trusted, people have to trust that the police can police themselves.
Yes.
I'm going to move you from criminal investigations, and I want to put you in a brand new professional responsibility. I need you to build this up and create an environment where the public can trust that the police can trust themselves. So again, that's what led to my working with the Department of Justice, coming up with those recommendations, but also specifically that there was one situation, and in policing, we have to be very careful, because a bedrock of American society is unions, and police unions are very powerful. It's policing's third rail.
Yes.
So you got to be able to create policies, procedures, and address the people while staying within the confines of union contracts and things like that. So I had a situation where, in being in professional responsibility, we created what's called an early warning tracking system, where because oftentimes you get a citizen complaint and you may not be able to prove it or disprove it, but it happens. We had an officer who was a probationary officer who had 6 complaints of excessive force in his probationary period. None of them was founded, but as the assistant chief in charge of professional responsibility, my decision was, if you got 6 complaints of excessive force in your first year on police job, we can't afford to keep you for the rest of, and take the chance that you're going to get better. So that's one of the ways of dealing with those type of situations.
Yeah.
Another thing is that as part of that role in professional responsibility, that my staff worked with the city in creating a civilian complaint review board, and with helping them shore up investigative teams, stuff like that, and understanding that while we police ourselves, there's a second layer of policing that goes into civilian complaint review. That when you are in charge of policing the police, you understand that you may have to police your friends.
Yeah.
But if you talk to Reggie or Nigel, I grew up and I was at Howard University, and I know a lot of people in DC. I got to police those people as well. And if you make a stop and they say, hey, I know Brian Jordan, if that guy's doing something wrong, lock him up. So we have to address the accountability parts and make sure as a police department we can police ourselves. But that's not happening all across the country. If that was happening, we wouldn't be here. We got to get better at that. We got to create the avenues to fix those areas where we're not right, while understanding we don't have to recreate the wheel. That, like one of the people put up a quote from Chief Ramsey, we got the playbook. All we got to do is go by the playbook and hold people accountable to the playbook.
I have a question that came in that is a very innocent question. I like it, and I want to frame it in the context of the police union. It says, do you believe the police force can willingly change, or will there be resentment? As I thought about that question, I think of all the times the police unions have come out. In fact, there's one police union chief head that actually said, you now need to question what you're seeing on the videos, on the body cam. In other words, these body cams, you need to question what happened before all the things that you just saw that went on for 2, 3, 8 minutes and 46 seconds. And then we also had a situation where I think it was in Buffalo, where they resigned when the police had hit down the guy who fell. I think the 70-year-old man that fell, and they resigned. So when I think of this question, I'm wondering, where does the union come in perpetuating what we're seeing going on with racism in the police, within the police, within law enforcement, or just simply brutality against African Americans? Where do they come in, Chief? What have you had to grab with? Let me even go to Reggie and Nigel a little bit. How do they contribute to all of this? Reggie?
Yeah, I mean, the union's there to protect you. I mean, it's more than a contractual thing. It's there to protect you. But if you have done something that is against the law, if you should be charged with the crime, the union still should be in place for those officers that are doing their job and doing it with the right honor and integrity as they should be. The union is not there to protect those officers that need to be prosecuted for an unjust job out in the streets. So I understand what people are saying with the unions. When you look at the private sector and different other organizations and jobs and careers and professions, you see that they don't have a union to protect them. You do something wrong, you get fired, you lose your job, you lose your 401k, whatever the case may be. I think we should be held to the same standard, the same accountability as the chief said. We swear an oath to do a job, to do it the right way. And if we do the job the right way, and we have our body cameras and our dashboard cams, and people think that something wasn't right, then the union should have our back and should support us. But again, if we're wrong and we're in the wrong, then we should be held to the same standard that anyone else would be, that we would apprehend in the case of a crime.
Nigel, any input on that?
Yeah, with that being said, I can understand why people will feel that the unions are protecting bad officers. Let's go straight there. They figure that all unions are protecting bad officers. But what people gotta also remember is, like, on their jobs, a lot of employees need protection from, different type of situations that they encounter on their jobs. The police department is no different. Now, I am 100% sure what the union saw what happened to George Floyd. They told that officer, "You're on your own. What you did is a crime, and we will not represent you on that." I hope that's some of the words that they use for that former officer when they see what they saw. But then you also got to remember, there are a lot of good officers out there that also need protection and need job protection like everybody else. And again, I say this with full awareness that a lot of people are like, well, you know what? The union's the part of the problem. Maybe unions, like Mr. Bull is saying, that the union may protect bad behaviors. It's more to it than just that. Because just like you and I can have a bad day, Mr. Bull, you might have a bad day. Listen, sometimes the unions could just like say, you know what, that's one, and leave it at that. But you also understand, when you have situations of such gravity like what happened to Mr. Floyd, the union is not going to protect them. A union worth their weight is not going to protect that type of behavior. It's more to it than just like, a union is protecting bad officers. Yes, there is a culture. Yes, there are officers that need to be addressed. There's no doubt about that. There's officers that need to be addressed. And there is a kind of perception that unions allow certain things to happen. Because you know what? That's a police officer. That's part of the family. Yeah, he may have smacked up that person, but you know what? He's part of the family. We're going to protect that. That culture is changing. This is what we're doing in this conversation. That culture is changing. It used to happen years ago. And the thing what the general public do not see is what's happening behind the closed doors. I know of officers that work North Bronx, conduct themselves in a way that's questionable, and been called by the unions to come all the way downtown and explain yourself before this gets out of hand. Explain yourself. So again, a union is necessary, just like any other job. But I think unions also realize there's certain things that this cannot be condoned.
Ladies and gentlemen, you are tuned to the Courageous Conversation. Let me just remind you of the 4 protocols engaged in this conversation, because we knew that tonight was critical. Tonight was important. It's law enforcement. It touches our lives every day. It is what we're seeing. It is what we're experiencing and what's creating angst. In fact, when I posted that I was interacting with, my run was interrupted by law enforcement, everybody was like, what happened, Ricardo? It was nothing negative. But we understand the natural response. So just reminding of our 4 protocols tonight before we press further. Stay engaged. Experience discomfort. It is uncomfortable, but it's necessary. Speak your truth. You may not agree with some of these gentlemen as they express themselves and as they share their own position. That's okay. That's why we're here at my kitchen table. But expect and accept non-closure, meaning we won't and we may not arrive at any solution tonight, but that's why we have the conversation to go in and press in. And also remember, those of you watching along, that you can become a part of what we're doing. Be the change that you want to see by being a part of our Raising Black Men Mentorship Program. You can participate in any way you can. I have a very probing question here, gentlemen.
I'm sorry, Ricardo.
Yes.
Before we move on, can I come back to that third rail conversation?
Go ahead to the third rail.
Because it's important.
Go on third rail, right.
That unions are important. Unions serve a purpose. That what happens is that when you talk about the role of a union, that they serve as the defense attorneys or defense representatives for officers. So just like when we lock somebody up, we know that if they have counsel, what the rules of engagement is or would be for counsel. The point becomes is that when we start talking about reform, and again, let me be clear that police chiefs sign off on those union contracts. Mayors sign off on that union contract. So they know the rules of engagement which they're working with. But I think what happens is, and again, another recommendation I think we have to look at is that we have, just like with the Fourth Amendment against unreasonable search and seizure, there what's called the exclusionary rule, where there has to be a emergency exception to union contracts. For example, that if you look at the George Floyd situation, and people don't want to hear this, that with the George Floyd situation, the Minneapolis 4, those people were fired in 2 days. That it is clear that is going to be a violation of their union contract. But the mayor and the police chief made the decision that this situation was such a shock to the conscience that we will create an exception to our union contract, and we're not worried about 5-day notices. We're not worried about appeal rights, that we're going to fire you now because this is such a shock to the conscience that we can't allow this to go unaddressed. So I think we have to get to a point when we're dealing with unions where we can keep contracts in place. We can allow those things that we negotiate and we sign off on to stay in place, but understand that there's exigency sometimes. And when there's an exigency, there has to be executive capacity to create an exception clause.
Good. In fact, that's a good point made in terms of the guys were fired within a couple of days, despite the fact that they had, it violates contract. But I want to keep moving. Susie Dodd said firing them is not enough. Of course, it has to come through to conviction. We know that it's not just firing, not just charge, not just arrest, conviction. Here's a question, gentlemen, that I want to throw to. I'm going to be engaging I'm going to engage my viewers a lot more now. Here's a question that says, question for the officers. Since you're all in favor of ending police brutality? Will you support ending qualified immunity as we know it, which prevents individuals from recovering damages when the police violates their constitutional right? Gentlemen, do you support qualified immunity?
You want me to go first?
Anyone?
Yeah, it don't matter.
I think qualified immunity has a role. First of all, that people talk about the issue of qualified immunity, it doesn't mean that an officer is not held accountable. That when you think about qualified immunity, that they talked about the fact that an officer is working in a department that makes $40,000 a year. That if you take away qualified immunity and you can sue him for his $40,000, that you're not going to get anything from him anyway. The issue is that you can still sue those police departments in which they work for, and that's where the deep pockets are. If you're talking about holding accountable and making someone whole, would you rather get a $40,000 judgment on a police officer or a $2 million judgment on a police agency or $6 million? Now, again, I think one of the things that when people talk about getting rid of qualified immunity is because the goal is you want to hurt them as much as possible. Well, I think going to jail.
Yeah, and I think it's a fair goal, honestly, Brian. If somebody violates my constitutional rights, I want to hurt them. So let me just reflect.
I'm okay. I'm okay with that. But what happens is when you get rid of qualified immunity, because what happens is that if you get rid of qualified immunity, that's in every situation.
Yeah.
That if you take someone's life, then that could be an exception. But police officers, first of all, we talked about the education aspect. That police officers, many of them come on with GEDs and high school diplomas. That they are going to make mistakes, and when they make mistakes, there has to be the understanding that, hey, this is where, just like doctors make mistakes, that they have malpractice insurance and stuff like that. That when you talk about accountability, that firing becomes first, charges become second, but again, it comes down to prosecutors charging them. It comes down to juries convicting them. So that when you want to talk about accountability, there are different levels of accountability. But just like I can support unions, I can also understand that there are times where qualified immunity for police officers is reasonable because it was a mistake. It should be dealt with, but we're not talking about in the George Floyd situation.
Yeah,
Reggie.
Yeah, I want to chime in. I wholeheartedly agree with the chief. I think there should be certain exceptions to it, but just to get rid of qualified immunity as a whole, I don't think we should do. Like he said, sometimes people make mistakes and it should be dealt with. If a person is arrested, charged, and convicted, depending on what it is, then it may be certain exceptions to the rules, so to speak. But we have to remember, like, I just think that for the viewers out there and just in general, when I'm talking to people, off camera, just in my own personal time, law enforcement is not a profession that is necessarily something that people really inspire to do, depending on where you are throughout the U.S.
That's why I wanted to know why you went in.
Say it again?
That's why I wanted to know why you had gone into it, yes.
Right. So oftentimes, if we're starting to take all these, not just qualified immunity, but if you look at the salaries, you look at the benefits, if you want to defund the police and you do this, that, and the fourth and fifth, who's going to serve the community? I think about my grandmother, and I say this because it's interesting. I think about my grandmother. My grandmother called me when they had some riots and looting in Trenton going on. And she said to me, she said, baby, she said, I'm afraid what the police may do, referring to the white police officers. She said, but I'm also afraid of the people that live in my own community. So if we don't have any officers that want to take this job and do it for the right reason, because you're taking everything away from the police department, who's going to serve the community? I mean, I'm just asking. I mean, Ricardo, I know what you do, and you have the chief, you have Nigel, you have some very well-educated men on this panel. But oftentimes in these communities, and I hear what the chief is saying, I look at other aspects of life, and it's like I still feel like we need to have people that look like us in our communities as leaders. When I spoke to a pastor the other day, and I said, listen, he was a black man. I said, maybe you guys can tell me, Do you know of a church that has an all-black pastors or elders, let's say 5 or 6 of them, and the congregation is 10,000 white people?
Oh, if you know that church, let me know where it is. Yeah.
Okay, so when you look at someone like Chief Jordan, he's saying Howard 98% undergrad is African American. You got African American teachers. You have African American administration. Like, I'm not saying it has to be all black or all white this, or just black people police black neighborhoods or white people police white neighborhoods. But when we talk about this qualified immunity and just taking stuff away and defunding the police, what kind of candidates are we going to get? Because last time I checked, even when you look at these men that came before me, as trailblazers, like I once said, I don't often see, even with the distrust that's within the community, I don't see blacks and Latinos signing up to become police officers to try to help change the narrative.
I guess when I saw the question, I guess it's a question of justice beyond anything else. It is one that says, if my rights were trampled on, right? My constitution are trampled on, and I think I saw a comment somewhere. It's more than hurting. It is justice. It is what justice. I mean, one of the most popular song from an amazing Jamaican artist. It was equal rights and justice. It's basically what I think the whole discussion about qualified immunity is about, justice. So let me go to something, a stem of that question about rights. I was given a package recently about you have the right to remain silent. It's about I know your rights guide to law enforcement encounters. I've saved this package for the right time to discuss it, and I think now is the right time. We spoke about the list earlier, and that's the list that a mother gave an 11-year-old boy. Again, my son's 12 and 9, trying to figure out how to work them through this list. But here is a document about your rights. And one of the things I'm wondering, when I was warned by the person who gave me that, Ricardo, even though these are rights, please note that they can still be violated, even trampled on. There was a video I was about to play. The video was 2 officers showing up at an apartment of a black man who had a 6-year-old son inside. The man said, "My son is fine. I don't want to come in here." The officers refused to leave, having, a foot at the door to prevent him from closing it. "Officer, I don't want to come in." "Officer, you're a public servant. You're not permitted to come inside my home." Eventually, they went in. In other words, you can't stop me from coming. So let's talk about rights. Again, it's about this conversation all about empowering our young men, empowering everyone who's watching at this moment. So I have some rights here. What if an agent or police officer comes to your door? So the rights said, do not invite the agent or police in your house. Do not answer any questions. Tell the agent or the police you do not wish to talk to them. And I'm wondering, okay, does that work? Will it work? One other right, you do not have to answer any question. Another right, do I have to give my name? Of course, this says in some states you have to if they ask. Another right is, do I need a lawyer when you're being questioned? So the rights I'm thinking about, because for me, I'm more amenable to prepare my sons about their rights than giving them lists for them to survive. Officers, talk to me about those rights. Someone comes to my door, an officer, 2 officers come to my door. I tell them, I don't wish for you to come in here. You're not permitted to come in here. What happens? And in the event that they still decide to come, talk to us about rights. Because to me, it seems many times that my white counterparts know their rights, and actually demand it, and usually given it. We, for the most part, it's ignored.
The chief
Question, do these rights, us knowing them, help us in dealing with law enforcement?
Well, yes. Knowing your rights helps you with law enforcement. You're not just somebody that's just walking around oblivious to what your rights are. You know what your rights are. The
Tell
door.
us some of them. Yeah, go ahead.
No, going to the door is a perfect example. And again, I think it goes to what the chief was saying. Once you get the average two officers that get that radio call that something might be happening in an apartment 1A. We get to apartment 1A. We knock on the door. You come out, and then we start the questioning. Are you okay? We got this call, some type of disturbance. Yes, you should know your rights as a homeowner. You should know your rights. Everything is fine. Everything is fine. This is my home. This is my paper. I live here. Everything is fine. Well, we'll have to come inside and see. No, everything is fine. You don't have to come right. You do not have to come and see. Everything is fine. But again, it speaks to it answers the question you just posed. Now, if you don't know your rights, you have no clue about your rights, about the right to entry, warrant, in case of emergency. If you don't know it, and you're oblivious to it, then that person behind the shield will take advantage or will enter your home. I think it's very key, it's very important in our society, in our culture, that we know the rights that we expect in any city, because there tend to be differences in cities. Like in New York, you might have two officers that say, okay, everything is fine, I don't hear anything, I don't see anything, they might leave. Whereas maybe in the Midwest, they won't leave until they're satisfied that everything is okay. But it's key that we know our rights. We cannot walk around oblivious. We cannot walk around not knowing. We cannot walk around, because it's true. You go to a different neighborhood, an affluent neighborhood, they'll let you know, no, you can't even come on the property. You have to have a warrant. You have some kind of paperwork authorizing you to even come on the property, let alone the front door. But if we are not knowledgeable in our own rights, and again, it's not the cure all, because I'm sure there are a lot of the people watching here now that have expressed, they've been pulled over. Listen, this is my car, this is the paperwork. All right, I own this car. Regardless of what it looks like, and when you're used to seeing the driving this car, this is my car, this is the paperwork. But it goes back to the more you know, you're forearmed. The more you know, you have that knowledge.
Chief, thanks, sir. Chief, knowing my rights. How about help educate us tonight in terms of, against the backdrop? One of the things that I know, we know the backdrop of what happened to Breonna Taylor, Nona Warrant, all right? So in that area, we know all the change that we want. But before I get there, help us with some of the rights that you say, Chief, as we empower young men, know these, try to exercise these, despite what we know can happen. What are some of those, sir?
So first of all, and see, here is the difficulty in the conversation. When you say know your rights, that there are certain, like for example, we know as a police officer, we know when someone really knows what the law says. So basically, a number of things happen. So first, you take the situation with the foot in the door. That yes, the person was right, and the person said you cannot come up, and he said all those different words.
Yes.
And ultimately, they violated his rights.
Yes.
So he knew his rights. But here's some of the key things in understanding your rights.
Yes.
That somebody was talking earlier, and you talked about probable cause. That the first step that a police officer is allowed to do in confronting you is called a contact. In a contact, there is no legal obligation for the person to stop and talk to you. That hey, can I talk to you for a minute? No, I don't want to talk to you. That's the issue of a contact. Mm-hmm. That's when you hear someone says, well, you fit the description. Now it's raised to reasonable suspicion. Under reasonable suspicion, the rules of engagement of reasonable suspicion are limited. Mm-hmm. But so then it goes to the law of stop and frisk, that once you develop reasonable suspicion, you can do a stop and frisk of the person for weapons. And again, understanding what that means is it's a limited pat down, describably for something that could be a weapon. It doesn't mean can they go in your pocket to say, hey, what's that not in your pocket? Can that not be a weapon? That doesn't fit stop and frisk. So you need to be able to say, because they'll say, what's in your pocket? If it's not a weapon, you don't need to say what it is. You don't have to describe it, because again, that a stop and frisk is for weapons. So in knowing your rights, understand what you can do to that. Now, again, that's where oftentimes their language is where you consent. Hey, can I go in your pocket? Yes. Well, you've consented to the search, and now everything that comes from that is a consensual search. So knowing your rights is knowing what level of that stop is. That in that stop, once there's reasonable suspicion, again, and it's, to me, it drives me crazy because it's predominantly with the stops of black males.
Yes.
I have to handcuff you for my safety. That if you're stopping somebody for passing a $20 bill and you're simply checking out reasonable suspicion and you've done a pat down for weapons, how are you articulating that you're handcuffing for your safety? That's what you take the Rashard Brooks situation. Those two officers were very calm, and the conversation went on for 40-something minutes. And for those 40-something minutes, it was a valid police stop, escalated the way it was supposed to, contact, reasonable suspicion, search, identification, all those different things. So when you're talking about knowing your rights, going back to the point of the door, it comes down to exigency. That when they came to that door, and let's take it from the standpoint.
Yeah.
Yes, I did.
Yeah.
So let's take it from the standpoint. If the call was for a woman screaming, and now the belief is that there is somebody who is in danger. Well, if that person spent 10 minutes talking to you, and then a 6-year-old boy came out who has no reason or doesn't have the predisposition to lie and says, it's only me and my dad here and no one else is here, that took that reasonable suspicion for exigency away. And so again, when they entered his home, they violated his rights. So what I say is, I want people to understand is that find out their badge numbers, get their information, because it's easier to survive the violation and exercise your rights than try to take on the situation and lead to a bad encounter where a violation of rights turns even deadly.
Repeat that, Chief. It's easier to survive the situation. Repeat that for me, Chief.
It's easier to survive the situation and get remedies for your rights being violated than to challenge the situation and it turns bad and your family is trying to remedy the situation.
And I guess that leads to something that Reggie said earlier, just wanting to come home. We reach home safely, then I'll do it. And it seems to me as we come upon the 2-hour mark of our conversation that it's important that we do that. So badge number, all the things we can. Clearly, gentlemen, this is a really seemed to me in a way question of surviving the encounter, the interaction to come through and then hopefully to get remedy. We know that tonight, as we try to attach this, that we will not do justice to all the facets, the layered facets of law enforcement. But I want to come to you personally, because ultimately you are part of this. You bear the weight of the conversation of law enforcement. As you see the comments, my viewers are throwing stuff or are chiming in, which they have all right to do, and that's why they're part of this. You bear the weight of it. But I want to come back to you as fathers, brothers, sons, grandsons, black men. How do you feel, or a question I got, how do you feel right now as a black man in law enforcement, or was in law enforcement, with all that's happening in the society today? I go with you, Reggie, who is actively involved in law enforcement. How are you feeling these days?
Yeah, I mean, it's tough. It's tough because what's supposed to be such a noble profession is often frowned upon by blacks and whites and just people in society as a whole, usually, and not as a whole, but a large part of society frowns upon law enforcement. Or this may just be indifferent. But the way I look at it is this. Some people may call myself, I'm not sure about these other gentlemen on the panels, Uncle Toms or sellouts, whatever the case may be. But I look at it as I'm a trailblazer. I look at it as there was There was police brutality in the past. There's been a distrust between the police and the community that has developed over years from the civil rights era. And I look at this as an opportunity for me to get into the schools and do what's called a grassroots effort, to be in the classroom, to let kids, as I said earlier, see me, see my character, see what kind of man that I am. Let them, I talked to them about my son. I showed them the man behind the badge, so to speak. I let them see that I truly care about them. Let me give you an example, Ricardo, and for those that's listening. Last year, for a 5th grade student, in October, Halloween happened. Kids go when they trick or treat the way most people do throughout society. The next week I came back after Halloween. I asked some of the students what were they for Halloween. I asked one black student in particular. I said, without saying his name, what were you for Halloween? He said, Officer Wright, I was you. He said, because that's the impact that you've had on me over the last year. He said, seeing you every day, the way that you care about me, the way you talk to me, the way that you encourage me. I sat there and I took a picture with the young man and it brought tears to my eyes because I saw him the same way I would see my own son. So there has been some things that have happened negative in the past. And as C.S. Lewis said, we're not going to be able to rewrite the past. The past 400 years, we can't write what's happening, but we can change the future. And it starts with us. It starts with these men right here in the panel. It starts with myself, and it starts with white officers as well. But I know that when I go to work every day, I try to do the best job that I can. When someone comes in contact with Reggie Wright, I want them to say, you know what? The police system is not one that I necessarily trust, but that officer, that man, that brother, whatever they want to call me, he treated me well. He respects me. He cares for me. And I can tell you what, I was very proactive in the police department for a number of years. That's how I got into a specialized section. And I would say for every 100 people that I arrested for whatever it may be, 99 of them gave me a handshake and said, thank you. Not thank you for arresting me, but thank you for how you treated me. To me, that's what a trailblazer does. We lay the groundwork for those that's going to come after us, and that hopefully will change the narrative.
Nigel, well, thanks for that, Reggie. And again, I'm doing a health check with my brothers. What's going on here? How is that? How are you dealing with this? How are you feeling again, you're no longer in the force, but how are you dealing with all that's going on in society? The brutality of black men meted out at the hand of law enforcement. How is that affecting you?
Well, first I want to say to Reggie, outstanding job. I really lift my hat up to you. We need that in policing. We need that. I don't know. I tell you, it's mixed emotions. Part of it's outrage. A part of it is just like, I feel for the men and women who are out there, the good men and women officers who are out there for the communities, hand in hand with the communities. They're to protect the communities, doing it the right way. So it's a lot of mixed emotions for me. I've seen that picture of Mr. Floyd with the man's knee on his neck, and I just said to myself, that's not policing. That's not policing. That's a man that had some type of whatever grudge and just laid it out on that man. Essence of police brutality. So with that being said, I share some of the memories that Reggie has expressed. I remember being on the highway and pulled people over and caught them speeding. But each and every time, if I had to issue a summons, I said, listen, unfortunately, I had to give you this ticket. Now, I remember when I had to go to traffic court, there were quite a few people that actually thanked me right there for, being respectful and treating them with such respect to humanity. And when I see the efforts of police officers like Reggie, who are out there being the positive role models for those persons coming up, and for those persons looking at the police, it gives you hope. But at the same time, when you see what's going on around the country because of actions of officers, I mean, think about it. And I'm sure our panel is watching, our esteemed panel, and people are watching. When you call the police, you call a person that's supposed to help you. You call for help. You call for a guardian of the city. You call for a person, a professional person. And when the outcome turns out that you're disrespected, you're treated less than human by the very system that's meant and built to protect you. I mean, you have outrage, you have frustration, you have what you see that's playing out now because people have had enough.
Yeah.
People have had enough.
Yep.
You know, it's frustrating. It's
And
frustrating.
that's what it is.
It's the fabric. It goes to the fabric, and now you realize the power of the police department. It rattles the fabric of society. So I share the frustrations that are being played out. I share in them, and I gotta tell you, there's tears in my heart because that's not what a police officer is supposed to do. It's not what a police officer is. It's not what a police department is. A police department is there to protect each and every person, each and every citizen, no matter where you're from, what color. It doesn't matter. That's what a police department is about.
Right.
And again, as the chief well said, you have training, you have certain things that are put in place. Yet it speaks to the individual officer that goes into these departments with this training and expectations in place. And a lot of times it has to come from the top. This will not be tolerated. And at times it is. And people violate it, and those people will be punished. But again, my feeling is, listen, I feel the frustration. I feel the frustration.
Thanks for that, Nigel. Chief, swinging over to you. You've served all these years in it. And I'm going to ask you, but there's one other question that I need to tackle before I ask you how you're dealing with this. I'm going to tackle the D word because the D word has been popping up a lot, right? And I want to know what you hear, gentlemen, when you hear the D word: defund, dismantle. Defund, dismantle. We can't have a cogent conversation around law enforcement and get off this live without hearing what that says to you. So, Chief, when you hear defund the police, what are you hearing? And what we may have gotten wrong about asking, or is it something that should be pursued? What are you hearing, Chief? You have retired from it, yeah.
Well, so here's my thing in both D words. I'll take it from the back front. The concept of disbanding police, and there are people who say we need to dismantle police and just start over, and they'll use the Camden Police Department as an example of say, oh, they disbanded their police department. Well, what they did was got out of their union contract. They disbanded their police department, but took many of those officers and just had them serve in the same area under the banner of the county. And that you brought in new leadership, but policing is the same. Like I said, the playbook is the same. So what you do is now you get rid of the shackles that stop you from being able to reform, and you start all over. And so going to the defunding, that Camden originally had about 250 officers. After they disbanded it and reimagined, it was 450 officers. So you didn't change any money. So let's go to the defunding part. There are parts of policing that can be defunded. For example, that one of the things that we did in Metropolitan Police Department, I talked about it before, was communications division. That if we can create an Office of Unified Communications and you take those officers with guns out of communications, put trained civilians in there, that's money can go to that function. Another thing that we did was we used to have police officers with guns who did what we call crime scene examination or mobile crime, where they do the forensics part of policing. That in DC, we took that function. The District of Columbia created the Office of the Department of Forensic Services and took all that police forensic. So those police officers got out of the issue of crime scene search, and that money went to forensics. That when you start talking about identifying what you want police to stop doing, then I can probably support defunding. But just saying, hey, we're going to take $15 million, it's going to result in losing 250 officers, but we want you to continue to do the same thing. with less money. That's going to create a worse police department. That if you take $15 million and the chief then has to say, okay, where am I going to take this money from? Remember we talked about improving training? That's going to go. We start talking about body camera storage, keeping it for 10 years. That's going to go. So we start talking about arbitrarily and capriciously just taking millions of dollars from a police funding and say, you find out how to do your job now without that $15-20 million. All you're going to do is create poor police services worse than you currently have.
I tell you, Reggie, yes, so you came off mute.
Yeah, not one thing that's actually outline because obviously with me currently being in community policing now for almost 3 years, I see an exceptional need to be in the community, in the schools, working with the youth and just young adults in general. So let's just say that people say, I've heard people say over the past few weeks, take money away from the police department and put it into like community relations type things. Well, if you have people that's functioning in community relations and they're not actually police officers, you're not really building that trust between the community and the police department. You're building trust between the community and someone's just functioning in a community relations component. Does that make sense? So I feel like as police officers, they still need to see us in the police officer role so that they can then build trust with us. So when they interact with us on car stop or calls to service, that trust has been established because we've been in the community and we've been in the schools, and not just community events. My thing is actually having a presence in the school and in the community so that these kids and teens and young adults see what kind of men and women that we truly are. Right? They need to see that we are men and women of high integrity, of character, that we love and that we care. I think that is what's going to change the narrative. If you want to take money away and say, listen, I don't want to have Officer Wright on the road, but we're going to support him being in the schools full time and just doing that and just doing a character development curriculum and just focusing on that, so be it. But I still think we need to function in a police capacity for some things.
The funding of the police is not going to solve the problem. The funding of the police, this conversation about the funding of the police is not going to solve the bigger issue at hand. But also, add on to that, and I think the chief hit it well, Reggie, the chief hit it well. You defund the police. We're upset. We're taking money from the police. When your mother gets being robbed, house being broken into, she called 911. Who's responding? Your next door neighbor? Unless you know them like that. The person 5 houses down? The woman that's getting beat up by her husband. Who's you gonna call? The poor woman that's walking down the block, minding her business. She's going literally coming from the store to going to her house. She gets knocked out by a young man. Who are you calling? The funding of the police, it sounds nice, it sounds great. Let's punish the police officers. We get that. We understand that. Let's punish those bad police officers. But when you start talking about the funding of the police, and a police department as big as NYPD might be able to survive some type of defunding, but you got a police department that's much smaller than NYPD. What's going to happen when you take good officers off the road? Look at what's happened recently in New York City. All these fireworks going off. You got hard-working men and women need to get their rest, need to get their sleep because they got to work in the next morning. And these fireworks are going off. Who are they calling? They're calling this the very same officers. So we can understand the emotional, response of let's defund the police. Let's take money away from them. Let's, direct that money to city services. You also got to understand that a lot of police departments do have community policing. They have community policing. They are the window to city services. I've had to do it myself many a times, where people have called me for non-criminal activities and I've had to refer them to other city agencies. Now, what we got to do is just use those proper police resources and get them in the community and get those relations coming. But when you talk about defunding the police, you really got to think about the bigger picture. As it stands right now, it was reported that New York City had 18 shootings within a 2-day period.
2 minutes ago, yeah. Mm-hmm.
18. That is a lot in a 2-day span. That's a lot.
Ricardo,
can I
have one last point on that?
Before I come to you, Brian, gentlemen, I know asking the question is really asking the question of the police, I really didn't expect a different answer. And I guess having another panel, we'll get something else. I'm coming to you next, Brian. But we know that this again is a layered discussion, that there's certain things we wanted to tap. I'm gonna have two more questions before I jump up, but Brian, you want something to say? Go ahead.
Yeah, and again, just finally on the issue of defunding the police, that the way we got here was recognizing that police officers are engaging in systemic racism, which is causing the lives of unarmed Black people. Defunding and creating a smaller, less trained police department does not do anything to help that issue and that narrative.
It doesn't, you think? It doesn't.
Because again, you take away money, you make it smaller, and if you leave the same racist officers responding to the calls that they still respond to, you still have the issues of innocent people being killed by the police.
The question still at hand, gentlemen, the question still at hand, my viewers, and I know that quite a few are still on, is how do we tackle the issue of racism in the police department? I'm going to switch totally something, because I still want to go to the human, to you. As Black men first, law enforcement agents secondly, what has been your personal negative experiences with the police as Black men, Black law enforcement officers, and how differently were you treated when they found out you were one of them? And I ask you that in the context of reading about the chief of police in Detroit, I believe, either past or present chief, who had many stories of himself victim of racial violence of people in the police there. So I'm just curious, Reggie, policing in New Jersey, have you ever been pulled over? Have you ever been handled and then they found out that your ID, you're a police officer? What is that like?
Yeah, I don't know if it's God's grace or what, but for me personally, I've never had any kind of rough interactions with police officers when I've been off duty. I just haven't. I've been stopped. I have been stopped a few times, and I've always been treated with respect. I'm just being honest.
Yes.
I've had some personal dealings without, because I'm still on the job. I've had some things where I dealt with where I'm like, there's some underlining racism that, well, obviously the tone and what was said and how things were said, obviously was because of the color of my skin. And I had to deal with that. But again, I call that the Jackie Robinson effect, right? I'm laying down the groundwork and trying to be a trailblazer for those that come after me. So I'm going to face some of that stuff. I have to be willing and ready to endure that for your son, Ricardo, or for the panelists on here for their sons or daughters, whatever the case may be.
Yeah.
But as far as being off duty, I've never been handled in a way that I look back and go, man, like that was foul.
Yeah.
On the job, there's some stuff, but it hasn't been anything where it needed to be like pressing charges or anything like that. But it's just I need to set them straight, which I have no problem doing.
Okay. Nigel, have you ever had any experience?
While I was on the job, I had experience. I was pulled over. Nothing physical or anything like that. But like Richard said, it was the tone. The first approach to the car, and it was just like once they see you, once they take a look at you, it was the tone. And once I ID'd myself, that tone turned, oh, he's one of us. So it seems to be that almost us versus them mentality from our counterpart there. Once you ID'd yourself, it was like, all right, the layer came down, the bias seemed to come down because they figured we were one of them. I've also been profiled. There was one time driving down south for a funeral, and the officer was on the side. I drive past him. He pulls out, and they even pulled me over at first. Went right next to me, looked at me. So as you know, New Yorkers, you know how we feel as far as, we're on the road and, somebody looks at you, you look at them, you kind of get that feel for each other. And then he pulled me over. And again, it was that tone. But once I ID'd myself, he still even had a little bit of a tone because there are many stories of officers, police officers going down south and again, the type of treatment they get from the counterparts down south. And again, it seemed like, oh, okay, he's one of us. He's okay. So yeah, I've dealt with that. I've definitely dealt with that.
All right, Chief, how about you?
Hey, it's funny. It's similar to Nigel's story. I was a young sergeant, detective sergeant, working in a homicide branch, and I had a brand new BMW. So now you got this young African American male in a BMW. So I drive. I'm headed home, and I drive up the street, and I pull up right next at a stoplight next to it was actually a white female canine officer. We looked each other in the eyes because we're both stopped at the light. I look at her, she look at me. I make a right turn on red, start up the street. She makes the right to follow me. I immediately pulled over. So she pulled over and turned her lights on. So she came up to the car and she said, "Where's the effing fire? Where's the effing fire?" I said, "I'm not sure where the fire is, but here's my license, registration, and my identification. I'm a sergeant with the homicide branch. And whatever I did wrong, I expect you to write me a ticket, but I like a supervisor respond to the scene because I'm interested in why you stopped me." And so Lieutenant came to the scene, talked to her, didn't even talk to me. She came back and said, "It's not worth the effort." Gave me my license registration back and let me go. That was the gist of the stop.
Mm.
Now, clearly, I know why I was stopped because she looked me in the eye. I looked her in the eye. She saw what I was driving. Clearly, if it was a right turn on red, she'd have said, "You know, why'd you run the right turn on red?" She said, "Where's the effing fire?" So I knew what that was about. But again, not to the point of trying to make a complaint about it. It's understanding is what happens. And that's why, again, as you become a leader, you get a chance to now have an impact on that.
Be the change that you want to see. And that's where we're going to end it tonight in terms of our conversation. I have a feeling this is only part one of our courageous conversation with law enforcement, as courageous conversations seem to go. Be the change you want to see. Hey, my viewers, as you've stayed with us tonight for the past 2 hours and 22 minutes, here's how you can participate. Go to this website right now, raisingblackmen.org. Join our cause to change the way our young men navigate through the society. These men on this panel, they are willing and ready to participate and to come alongside us in a Raising Black Men mentorship program. We'd love for you to participate. We'd love for you to donate. We'd love for you to come on board as a mentor or sign up your sons as mentees to be mentored by us and my group of brothers who are coming on board to become mentors in this, what we call Be the Change You Want to See, raisingblackmen.org. It's another night of courageous conversation. Gentlemen, let me thank you. Thank you for spending these moments with me. We know, and we knew from the beginning, that our conversation with law enforcement was only opening the door to various facets of the things that we want to discuss. Thank you, Reggie, for coming on board. Thank you for your willingness. Thank you, Nigel Bryan, for spending these moments. Chief Brian Jordan, from day one, you said, "Yes, Ricardo, I'm here and I'm willing to participate." We knew you handled some questions. We knew you saw some comments, but you are the very definition of having successful Black men in this society who can demonstrate and show to others that we are not a statistic. We don't have to be a statistic. We are not a threat. We don't have to be an endangered species, but we know the conversation continues. And so for you, my viewers, keep the conversation going. With next time we speak, this may be coming to you, Brian. Next time we speak, it may be a part 2, or I have a nice little one working on for you, which you're going to like. It is basically the Black woman speaks. No woman, no cry. Stand by. That's going to come up next on a courageous conversation. Brian, you wanted to say something? Everybody, I'm going to give a chance to say something before you go. Go ahead, Brian.
Yeah, I did not want to get off without telling you thank you. You know, having a chance to meet you and be a part of this panel, and having a chance to converse with Nigel. But I still have to say, Reggie Wright, I like that young man. Reggie Wright is the future of policing. That I am so proud of the work he's doing and the chance to meet and work with him. I've already committed to trying to be a mentor to him going forward, where I can help. And again, the reason, like you asked me about how I feel, that these type of conversations has created a new sense of urgency for me. I felt good being retired, but this type of conversation gets that little itch going about wanting to get back in the game. So
Yes.
thank you, and I appreciate being a part of this panel. And for all the questions, I hope we was able to answer those questions and at least respond to some of the things that you was putting out there. So thank you.
Thanks, Brian. Nigel, anything last word before we go?
Invite me onto this panel. Again, it's a great opportunity to open the door for our panelists, for those who are asking questions, because it's a very serious topic. It's very serious, and it just strikes me because not only are we sharing, but also we're sharing for those that are coming up. I mean, these are very serious times. How do we teach our young boys and girls how to interact with police and not be afraid of police? How do we teach them to interact in society and be recognized as the strong force that they're going to be, and that they are? So it's a great opportunity to share. So I'd say thank you so much. Thank you to Chief. You guys are doing wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. And listen, don't leave me out of the conversation. I want to help out too, where I can mentor and help this fine young man, this police officer, doing what he's doing. But again, God bless us all. For everybody that's watching, please know that we're here because we care. We care. We care, and we want to see our culture not only survive but thrive. And if anything that we can share that inspires you and says, you know what, I'm going to give this to my son, to my daughter, because when they go out, I want them to come back home alive, safe. When they go out, I want them to go out and feel and expect the same expectations of freedom that everybody else feels. Our culture demands it. Our culture is our time. The things of the past have changed us for too long. The things of the past have scarred us for too long. And we are as eligible and expectations for that right as anybody else. Again, Reggie, I love what you're doing. Moving out the conversation. Chief, a pleasure to meet you and speak with you.
Reggie.
Yeah, man, I'm grateful. So grateful, extremely grateful for the opportunity, this privilege that you asked me to come on here, Ricardo. Thank you so much, Chief, for your kind words and for agreeing the other night to actually mentor me and walk through some things with me as I continue to progress throughout my career. And Nigel, it's a pleasure to meet you, man. I have to say, while God gives me breath in my body, I wouldn't be sitting here right now today on this panel, having this discussion, having this opportunity, if it wasn't for the Lord, his grace, for his mercy. If it wasn't for my grandmother, a woman from Corinth, Mississippi, that came here in 1957. She worked 2 jobs, worked in the school system for 35 years, struggled after raising her own 2 kids, stepped in and helped raise me. But also, if it wasn't for a man that was actually commenting a couple of times, I don't know if you guys saw it, a gentleman by the name of Mr. Charlie Ward. Mr. Charlie Ward mentored me, brought me to his home, let me live with him for 2 years. And if I'm honest, it's men like that have helped me get to where I am today. It didn't matter that he was an NBA basketball player. He cared about me. He cared about who I was and what kind of man I was going to be. Going to his home, I thought I was going to learn more about being a better basketball player. But I learned about how to become a man. I learned manhood. What does a man look like? What does it look like to be a Christian? What does it look like to be a father? What does it look like to be a man that has successes and failures? He walked with me. He loved on me. And that's what I hope to do in law enforcement. I hope to change the narrative and that these kids have an opportunity to see that this black dude from Trenton, who people didn't think was going to amount to nothing, I love and I care about them. And I want them to see that I'm truly trying to make a difference. And listen, When I saw a knee on the neck, I cried. When you played this thing in the beginning, it brought tears in my eyes. But we have to be mentors. We have to be trailblazers, and we have to be invested into the lives of those kids that are coming up because they're the future. So I thank you, gentlemen, here on this panel. And of course, Charlie, you know I thank you, man.
And that is what RaisingBlackMen.org is about, ladies and gentlemen. It is Reggie who said to me from day one, Ricardo, I want to be a part of mentoring those young men that you're going to be mentoring through your program. I know Brian will be a part of this. Nigel is already on board mentoring men. So those of you who are watching, these are the caliber men that we have enlisted to mentor your sons, your nephews, your brothers, your husbands, the men in your life. We believe that that night on the 28th of May, as I sat down on my step, wondering how to engage all of this craziness going on, this is the reason I didn't recede in the comforts of a nice little neighborhood, but decided to abandon the veneer of what looks nice and safe and smiling and press into what's needed now. It is Reggie, it is Brian, it's Nigel, it is me, it is Roger, it is Maurice, it is Dwight, it is Kadeem. It's all the men, it is Wayne Elliott, it's all the men who have come on and said, we're gonna be beside you, Ricardo, as we make the change and be the change we want to see. You can be a part of this change. Simply go over to RaisingBlackMen.org. You may donate. You may sign up to mentor. You may sign up your sons to be mentored. These are the caliber and the quality black men we have parading for the world to see who they are. Men of integrity, quality, dignity. Keep the conversation going. It's my intention that every Sunday night, whenever we meet here, maybe twice a month, that we will probe the conversation that makes us uncomfortable even. But ultimately, it is to create change in the lives of you and of me. I want to say thank you so much to my excellent, hardworking technical director behind the scene. As always, Seneca Ball, thanks so much for keeping us on air. Thanks again to all my panelists, men of excellence. Thank you for watching. Keep the conversation going on until next time. I'm Ricardo Bryan. God blessings be yours. Good night.